Hello and welcome to another Pressing In. Our desire and goal at Pressing In is to take what we're talking about through our online service and have honest, frank conversation with leaders from around Blue Ridge. And what we're trying to do is look for practical ways to apply to our lives what we talk about through the rest of our week. Well, last week, we looked at the book of Philemon and we asked the uncomfortable questions. Why should the church talk about racism, and how should we go about doing it? So today, we want to apply a little bit of what we talked about. You see, a few weeks ago, based on my own journey and desire to seek and understand more about what others have experienced with regards to racism, with a heart to hear from someone whose life experience is different than my own, I did what I asked you all to do this last week. I reached out to Chaka Burnett, who has attended Blue Ridge with his wife Chaka for the past 6 years, and invited him out for a cup of coffee. Now, we had a great conversation. In fact, I wish we would have had cameras with us to record us that day, but we didn't. So I thought it would be great to invite Troy and his wife Chaka to take part in a pressing in conversation so that once again, we could hear a couple of other personal perspectives on the issue of racism. So please, if you would, right now, would you ask God to open your heart to listen to part one of a conversation with Troy and Chaka Burnett. I want to start off because while you guys have done announcements, Troy, you've done a couple videos for Blue Ridge, you've done a couple live elements, I don't think many people know you guys. And so I think story is the best way to get to know one another. So I'd love to start off with your stories. You know, if you could give me the Reader's Digest version of your stories growing up. So
I grew up pretty much everywhere. I am an Army brat, so to speak. My father was in the military. And so we started off very little moving around. A lot of my life was spent in other countries. My experience, I actually didn't move back to the United States till I was older. And we moved to California and then we moved to Maryland. But a lot of my older years from middle school up were spent in Maryland. And so I moved to Virginia for school, and that's where I met my husband. And then we went back to Maryland, and now we're back in Virginia again, obviously. I look at my experience as being somewhat different. I come from an experience of being immersed in diversity, immersed in culture, immersed in just overall acceptance, I think. Since I moved away so young and I had the opportunity to be in such a blended experience with military individuals, people from other countries, and things like that, I actually did not realize how heavy the impact was on my life until we came back to the United States. And I was older because in other countries, my differences were accepted. I was seen as American. I never experienced the idea of you're Black, you're African American, you're brown, you're different. It was you're American, you're cool. We want you to be your friend. We want to know you. And so when I came back to the United States and I went to school here, I went to a private school, which was predominantly Caucasian. I was one of the first African Americans to actually graduate from the school. And my experience of being the only person of color in my class, or at least the only obvious person of color in my class, was my whole life story growing up. So it didn't seem very different. I actually felt more of that stretch when I would go back to like church, and church was where I was immersed in Black culture, and assimilating on both sides. I felt myself having to constantly go back and forth. And in class, I was one way and talked a certain way, and my friends and I engaged in certain things. Like I used to go whitewater rafting and hiking and things like that, like serious whitewater rafting and stuff. And I would come back and say to my friends at church, guess what I just did? It was so much fun. And their response would be like, you talk white, you do white things. Like, that's just really weird. And so finding that balance. But I mostly noticed it, like I said, at that point in conversation when people would call me out on it. But then also in school, adults had a way of making me understand, not always intentionally, that I was different. It was very obvious that they didn't understand because as I got older and started embracing my culture, I found that they they would call me out on some of the differences. My hair, for instance, having my hair braided was not seen as what they considered natural. So I remember getting called out on that and they wanted me to tell my mom that I had to take my braids down. I had to, certain music, couldn't listen to certain music. It was seen as too ethnic or too worldly or too what have you. And it was part of gospel hymns, part of my culture and things like that.
You were listening to Black gospel music, and that was too worldly.
Wow.
Wow. So what was harder for you? Your Black friends at church telling you you do white things or you talk white, and that's weird, or the adults in your life making you feel like you stand out and are different, or parts of you aren't accepted? Which one was more of a struggle for you?
The adults.
Okay.
And the reason for that would be these were individuals who, like my friends who did it, it was almost like picking on me. So that's how it came across. But when an adult said it to me, it made it seem like it was wrong. Like I should be ashamed or like I was being disciplined.
So both my parents were teenagers when I was born. They conceived me and had me when when they were both teenagers. And so I grew up in a household where my mother wasn't but so many years older than I am. My father was not in my life growing up. We just recently were able to reconnect and reconcile and stuff like that. And that's all through the gospel. My mother was young. My grandmother, coincidentally, I call my mother Ma and I call my grandmother Ma, because both of them were like mother figures to me. And plus, when you're in a household and your mother's only some years older than you, and your uncle's only so many years older than you, they call her Ma, so I'm calling her Ma too. So that ended up being that. So I ended up being raised by a lot of older people. My grandmother was born in 1945. She was born in 1945. And then, going to church, majority of the people there were older. I remember distinctly Brother Law being my Sunday school teacher, and he was born in 1920. And so here's this, 60, 70-year-old man teaching me. And I noticed a lot of times, like, we would read the scripture and he would give us a story about the scripture, but then he would always go back to telling us stories about how we need to grow up as men. And some of the things that he used to say to us was he would warn us about entering into the world because we didn't look the same as other people. And he said that we would be looked down upon, and it was our duty to make sure that we made ourselves presentable. And now this is a guy who was born 1920, went through the military like a lot of Black people did back at that time, because they thought military was going to be the opportunity for them to come up, quote unquote, come up. But then they would end up coming back and still being treated the same. I was that kid that was friends with all of the kids. And mind you, my mother, she worked multiple jobs. I remember at one time my mother worked 3 jobs just to provide for us. Mm-hmm. So I spent a lot of time like at daycare. And there was a girl there, and I was really good friends with. She was shorter than me, and she was white. And, she was really awesome. One day she was like, "I'm leaving. I'm not coming back to this daycare. I'm going to another daycare." And I was like, "Oh, why?" And she said, "My dad said there's too many Black people here." And it was at that moment I was like, what does that have to do with anything? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm totally clueless, but that always stuck with me. I was like 6 when I first heard that. And so that was like my first instance of realizing that there's a difference between people, and some people just don't like that difference. I remember distinctly one time I was going to pick up my friends who just coincidentally live in the hood, and I lived in the county. and we were going to practice. It was early morning, like a Friday or something like that. And I was going to pick them up, and I picked them up. We were going towards a school, and I just noticed that this police officer was just riding behind me for like 3 or 4 blocks. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna take this turn. Not going to where I was supposed to go. I was supposed to go towards the school. And I was like, all right, let me take this turn. And he's still behind me. I was like, okay, he's following me. My friends don't know what's going on, but I'm realizing what's going on. And eventually, I was always told that if you're ever pulled over, to make sure that you're in a well-lit place, whereas a lot of people, just to be cautious. Thankfully, it was in the morning time, so everything's well lit. And we just so happened to pull up in front of the courthouse, whatever the case may be. And in the midst of being pulled over, I was asked the questions of like, where are you going? What are you doing? Who are these people in your car? I was even asked, who owns this car? I was asked those type of questions. My friend was telling me last night, he was saying when he told his white friends that those are type of questions that people are asked of color, like when they're pulled over, they're like, I've never heard those questions before. And I thought that was a common thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, but evidently it's not. A lot of people don't experience that. And then, I'm from Martinsville, Virginia, which is home of the racetrack. And literally my house is less than 300 yards from the racetrack. And growing up there, we never really experienced racism directly. But there would be times where it would just be really weird situations that would come up. I remember distinctly, I have an uncle who's younger than me, and he has a old red Mustang. And I went to go visit him once, and he's driving me around, and I was like, hey, let's cut through this area because it's a shortcut. And the shortcut is through a nice area, predominantly white. And as soon as we turned on this block, I saw a police officer, and sure enough, after he passed by us, he did a U-turn in the middle of the street and started following. And I don't know why I knew that, but I just knew that was going to be the case. So we're pulled over, we're on the side of the road, and him and his colleague pull up, walk up to the car. But I noticed that on the passenger side, which is the side I'm on, the colleague has his hand already ready on his weapon. And I'm like, okay, all right, we need to de-escalate this as much as possible. The officer greets my uncle and says, hey boy, what you doing through here? Where are you going? The questions that I just talked about a little bit earlier. And he was, before he even asked for his ID, and my uncle's telling him, and he was like, well, let me see your ID. I know that police officers respect military. My uncle just so happened to be military. I said, hey, please give him your military ID too. Gave him his military ID. The whole conversation switched. Oh, hey, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for your service. Greatly appreciate you. The guy, as soon as he said that, the guy that was on the other side backed up, went back to his car, and he said, all right, you guys have a nice day. And so that's been kind of like life growing up, being mindful of my race in every situation, sometimes even going out of the way to make sure that other people feel comfortable.
Based on just a little bit, and I'm sure you guys are just giving us a little bit of detail about some of the experiences you had growing up, but based on some of your experiences at a white private school, based on your experience with white police officers, and I'm sure you have other experiences here, you guys work at a predominantly white work environment, and you go to Blue Ridge Community Church, a predominantly white church.
Right.
Help me understand, like, why? What do you see as the parts that are growing you in it? And what are the parts that you still have to wrestle through? Like, pull back that curtain a bit for me.
Good.
So, to be honest with you, acceptance has always been a thing that I've struggled with. And Chaka too, and a certain extent. We've always dealt with acceptance somehow, some way. But we've never let that fear hold us back from any possibility that we could potentially be. I mean, Chaka tells me all the time that I'm an evangelist. And so what does an evangelist do? From my perspective is that they go into uncharted territory and they end up being a thermostat, then a thermometer in that atmosphere. And so I've always been like that. And so I've never even the concern and the fear is always there, but you never let that hold us back. Specifically for Blue Ridge, we gave it the old, church shopping try. When we came here, when was that? 2013. Mm-hmm. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if I shared this with you. I was concerned that no one on leadership looked like me. That was a concern that I had. And I was like, because there are concerns that not only pertain to me as a Christian, but I can't deny the fact of who I am ethnically. You know what I'm saying? So I can't. So I'm curious as to if this church would be one that would be mindful of. Mm-hmm. And so, after going through a few services, we said coming into 2014, we're just going to try a church out for a month. And we tried Blue Ridge out for a month. They had things that catered to some of our other dynamics that we have, like we're a married couple. And we got into the married couple, it was Marriage Works, mm-hmm. and everybody embraced us. And we were treated like brothers and sisters. We were also treated like, from the older saints, they treated us like we were their daughters and sons. Mm-hmm. And we didn't feel outplaced. And so after that, I looked at Chaka, I said, I think we might have found it. And she's like, yeah, I think we did. And so we just went from there. Mm. Yeah.
I think to add to that, we just look for opportunity. And so Troy and I are individuals who are always seeking for an opportunity to grow. And so that's kind of what we look for. But in agreement with him, we found that the places we went had something that we needed in that season, and that's what we embraced. Understanding that there are differences, there are conversations that him and I have to have that we can't have with other people. Mm-hmm. So we lean on each other for that because there are differences, that we notice or we feel sometimes. But it doesn't stop us from wanting to be involved. Mm-hmm. Now, I will share this with you. I have to think about that when family comes to visit. Because for him and I, that might be comfortable and usual, but for our family members, it might be like, hey, this is a different service. No one looks like this. The music's a little slower. I'm
not sure if it was your mom or my mom. When they came once, they straight fell asleep during service. We've been exposed to different dynamics of ministry. So it was like, we've been to the charismatic, like some on a point of crazy charismatic. Mm-hmm. And then we've been on to the point of like so solid dry that no one will even clap. So we've been across the spectrum of types of churches. And, we had to realize that some of that stuff was just aesthetics, things that we just preferred. Mm-hmm. But what we had to ask the question, what do we need? Yeah. And we were kind of struggling at that mark of 2013 with our marriage. We had some issues in our marriage prior of me just making decisions for both of us that both of us didn't agree upon. Learned that one the hard way. that shouldn't do that. And so Blue Ridge was able to help us to grow as a married couple and stuff like that. Yeah.
And I mean, this was even our first time coming to a large church. So imagine, being in an environment where not only you're different, but it's gravely obvious, and things like that. And so that was even new, walking into a larger church and feeling like not only do we look different, not only are we out of towners, but worried about just being a number and so all of that plays into the assimilation process, and all of that plays into being comfortable. And so that was something that we had to work with too in the very beginning. But that's another thing that kept us here at Blue Ridge, because it wasn't hard. we came in and people just had a genuine desire to see us as believers and help us to grow as a couple and as believers. And so
Interesting, Chaka. You said something earlier that just got my mind wondering. So I'm going to ask it, and you don't have to share if you don't want to. But you said there's some conversations that only you and Troy can have. I'm curious for all of YouTube. I'm curious for all of you. What are some like? Give me if you're willing, a peek behind the curtain at what some of those conversations. What would those be?
I knew this conversation was going to be exposing. I told my husband, I said, especially with one of the topics, I was like, I feel like we're giving up secrets. Things that just like, hi, and kind of deal. The one thing I didn't share in my growing up story was my mom was intentional about exposure. And so my mother played a heavy part in me understanding. I was taught the way everyone else was. I was given the stories of, you're going to be looked at differently. You're going to have to understand your environment in a different way. You realize that you're going to the school, but you're not like them. But at the same time, my mom was also very big on immersion. And so when we were overseas, I lived in Germany. She put me in a German school. Didn't speak English. They didn't speak English. I had to, learn to get around. When I lived in Italy, I went to an Italian school. When we were overseas, we traveled everywhere. And so when I got to the point of being older, I was already used to knowing that there were differences, embracing those differences and celebrating them and getting excited about them. It was such a turnoff to me that people were not. And it was such a hard thing to embrace that it wasn't the normal thought. Sometimes, like even in conversations like what are happening right now, you can tell someone wants to ask or wants to just kind of lean in a little bit more, but they're scared to be offensive.
And we notice it.
And we notice it.
Yeah, we notice it.
Or concerned.
And we'll be back at home like, I think she really did.
She really wanted
I could tell, but she was waiting for us to crack, but we weren't gonna crack because we was waiting for her to. It was like, what you about to say?
Yeah. I think there's one time when Blue Ridge did a choir.
Okay.
And they actually did a gospel song. It had parts and everything. And I told him, I just got so giddy by that. But at the same time, we were looking and I was like, you could tell some people are a little uncomfortable, because ironically, in enjoying the moment, another reaction of mine was to look around and see how people felt.
Yes.
Naturally was to look around and say, is this okay? Because in that moment, you guys had given permission for it to happen. But I almost still felt, because I knew that was part of my culture, that I had to get the permission from other people. It's like, they don't know how to react.
And if other people feel comfortable, then we feel comfortable to be ourselves. But if they don't feel comfortable, then we have to modify ourselves in order to make sure that we don't stand out. We already stand out. So, first of all, I'm 6'2". My wife with heels on is 6'7". You know what I'm saying? So, and she looks like an Amazon, and we're both black. You know what I'm saying? So we already stand out. We don't want to stand out even more. I remember even one time in the Together service, I really was feeling like the spirit was bubbling inside of me.
He was the first Together service.
And I really wanted to give a loud shout of hallelujah. And it would be my praise to God. And it would be so genuine. But the moment that I do that, I'm still mindful that attention is going to be drawn to me. Yeah. And then I'm going to be categorized as that, Black charismatic man. You know what I'm saying? And I don't like to classify myself as being charismatic. I like to say I'm charismatic with a seatbelt on. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna be, waving snakes and stuff and so yeah, we being mindful. So we have those conversations when we get to the house.
Yeah. We have this conversation about work too. It's one of those things where before this instance happened, I think people tiptoed around it. And we knew within our own cultures, I'm pretty sure, that it was the elephant in the room, that it was conversations we might have with our families or close friends. And this conversation that's happening right now has forced everyone to talk out loud. And so one of the things that we even have to talk about now is we're going to walk into work, predominantly white again. We're going to walk into church, predominantly white again. And we're going to stand out more than we did before because the conversation is around our culture. And so the same way we were in service, like, is it okay? Are they okay? Now there's a possibility that people in service will look at any of us and say, are they okay? Is this okay? I mean, so the conversation is happening, but now it's magnified and it's amplified. And these are our experiences. You know, we're very clear to say that this is how we've experienced it through our eyes alone. We can't speak for every person. But when you are the minority, it's hard for people not to see it that way.
Once again, thanks for listening. Join us again next week for part 2 as we talk about things like the George Floyd murder, as they teach me a new term I wasn't familiar with, and as we continue this important conversation. Let's fight to be an expression of the church that's slow to speak, slow to anger, and quick to listen. Who is God asking you to listen to this week? See you all next week.